The sky over the coastal city was painted in vibrant shades of orange as sunset fell, the light streaming through the glass walls of the expansive office on the 45th floor of Hawthorne Tower. Adrien Hawthorne, 38 years old, stood there, a tall figure in a perfectly tailored black suit, but his dark brown eyes looked tired, as if the brilliant light outside couldn't quite reach him. The walnut desk in front of him was buried in paperwork, and the computer screen blinked with numbers from the latest financial reports. An important shareholder meeting was about to take place, but his mind was tangled with the mounting pressure from the new resort project. He sighed, rubbed his temples, then reached for the phone on his desk. "Cancel this afternoon's meeting," he muttered, imagining the soft voice of his assistant, Clara, on the other end of the line. His finger moved quickly across the screen, selecting the contact he believed was Clara's. The phone rang once, twice, then a small, trembling voice answered, completely different from Clara's. "Hello? Are you the man who's coming to take our house?" Adrien froze, his brow tightening. The voice belonged to a child, fragile but anxious, as if every word was squeezed from a heart clenched in fear. He set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, trying to process this unexpected situation. "No, kid, you've got the wrong number," he replied, his voice deep but cold, exactly like a man accustomed to running the world from this very seat. He was about to hang up, his finger hovering over the red button, when another tiny sound reached him, a stifled sob, barely audible but enough to make his heart pause. "Please, don't take our house," the child's voice quivered, as though fighting back tears. "My mom and I don't have anywhere else to go." A chill ran down Adrien's spine. He wasn't someone who got emotional easily. In the cutthroat world of real estate, he had learned to lock his feelings away, leaving only sharpness and determination. But that voice, so small and desperate, touched a hidden corner inside him, a place he had tried hard to forget. He remembered his own childhood, the days when his family had faced losing their home to debt. That memory, long buried beneath years of success, rose up again, sharp and fresh, like a wound reopened. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost unconsciously. He sat up straight, his eyes fixed on the empty space before him, as if he could somehow see the child through the phone line. "I'm Sophie," the little girl answered, still shaky but sounding a bit less afraid. "I'm 8 years old. You're really not the man coming to take our house?" "No, I'm not that person," Adrien said, an unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. He wasn't used to talking to children, wasn't used to the raw honesty in every word. "Where is your house, Sophie?" She hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust this stranger. "On Bayview Street, apartment 3B, she finally said, her voice fading to a whisper. "My mom said we might have to leave because we don't have enough money." Adrien took note of the address, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk without thinking. Bayview, a rundown apartment complex his company had just acquired for redevelopment. He knew those units well, peeling walls, creaking staircases, and families struggling to hold on to their homes. But this time, the information wasn't just numbers on a report. It was Sophie's voice. It was the real fear of a child. "Sophie, where's your mom?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of concern he didn't even realize was there. "She's working. She works all day," Sophie replied. Then suddenly she gave a little sob she couldn't hold back. "I don't want Mom to be sad. She cried yesterday because of the money." Her words cut through the armor Adrien had built over so many years, like a tiny blade. He looked out the window. The sunset had faded, leaving behind a deep purple sky. For a moment, he saw himself a little boy powerless to do anything, while his own mother cried over bills piling up on the kitchen table. He knew he should hang up, should return to his work, to the numbers and the contracts. But for the first time in years, he didn't. "Don't be scared, Sophie," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm going to look into this, okay? I promise." "Really?" Sophie asked, her voice brightening just a little, as if a single promise from a stranger was enough to spark hope. "Really," Adrien replied, though he himself wasn't sure what he was doing. When the call ended, he sat there, phone still in his hand, his gaze distant. His mind was in turmoil, not because of numbers or a canceled meeting, but because of an 8-year-old girl and the voice that had awakened a part of him he thought had died long ago. The next morning, Adrien sat in his sleek black Bentley, his eyes fixed on the muddy Bayview road ahead. The old apartment complex loomed like a scar on the face of the modern coastal city. Stained exterior walls, broken windows patched with tape, and a faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. He gripped the steering wheel, wondering what he was doing there. A CEO like him didn't make a habit of coming to places like this himself. This was work reserved for lower-level managers. But Sophie's trembling voice from the night before still echoed in his head, like a song he couldn't turn off. He needed to know who she and her mother were, to understand why a child could be so afraid. Adrien stepped out of the car, his expensive leather shoes sinking lightly into the thin layer of mud on the walkway. Apartment 3B was on the 3rd floor, the staircase groaning with every step he took. His palm was damp with a strange feeling nervousness, or maybe worry, as he knocked on the door. The door swung open, and in front of him stood a woman with wary dark brown eyes. Elena Martinez, early 30s, wore a worn-out t-shirt and faded jeans. Her hair was tied back, though a few strands had fallen loose across her forehead. She stood squarely in the doorway, like a wall protecting something precious inside. "Who are you?" Elena asked, her voice firm but edged with exhaustion. She looked at Adrien's elegant suit, suspicion flashing in her eyes. "You're the property manager, aren't you? We're packing up. Don't bother evicting us, we'll be gone soon." Adrien blinked, realizing she'd misunderstood. "No, I'm not the manager," he said quickly, raising a hand as if to reassure her. "I'm Adrien Hawthorne. I called the wrong number last night and spoke with Sophie." Elena frowned, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Sophie?" she murmured, turning her head and lowering her voice. "Sophie, come here." From the corner of the room, a small girl stepped out, clutching a worn-out teddy bear. Sophie, with messy brown hair and wide eyes, looked up at Adrien as if trying to decide whether he was friend or foe. "You're the man on the phone," she said, her voice small but steady. "You promised you would help." Elena folded her arms, her gaze never leaving Adrien. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold but betraying a subtle tremor, fear of losing the last place they had to stay. "If this is some kind of joke, I don't have time for it." "It's not a joke," Adrien said, doing his best to keep his tone calm, even as his thoughts churned. "I just want to understand what's happening. Sophie talked about losing your home." He hesitated, unaccustomed to explaining himself. "I'm the owner of Hawthorne Properties, the company that owns this building." Elena stiffened, her eyes darkening. "So you're here to make sure we get evicted on schedule?" she demanded, taking a step forward, her voice hardening. "We've tried everything. I just lost my job and—" "Mom!" Sophie interrupted, grabbing Elena's hand. "Don't be mad. He said he wasn't going to take our house." She looked at Adrien, her eyes shining with a little hope, but still shadowed by fear. "I don't want to leave. I'm scared. Like when Daddy left and never came back." Sophie's words struck like a blade, stopping both Adrien and Elena in their tracks. Elena dropped to her knees, pulling her daughter into her arms, her eyes softening but filled with pain. "Sophie, don't say that," she whispered, smoothing the little girl's hair. Then she looked up at Adrien, her voice quiet but steady. "Her father died in a car accident 4 years ago. Since then, it's just been the two of us. She's afraid of losing anything else." Adrien felt a tightness in his throat. He wasn't a stranger to grief. His own mother had died in an accident when he was young, but hearing Sophie mention her father stirred a strange ache inside him, as though he were the one who had suffered the loss. He looked around the small apartment, the old furniture, the cracks in the walls, a little table holding a few faded family photos. This wasn't just a unit, it was Sophie and Elena's entire world. "Listen," Adrien said, his voice low but clear. "I'm not here to evict you. I want to help." He paused, wondering what he was doing. This wasn't his way interfering in strangers' lives. But looking into Sophie's eyes, he couldn't walk away. "My company just finished a new building, Hawthorne Tower. We need cleaning staff. If you're willing, I'd like to hire you, Elena. In return, you and Sophie can stay in one of the apartments there until things stabilize." Elena blinked as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice thick with doubt. "Why would someone like you care about us?" Adrien didn't have a clear answer, even for himself. "Because Sophie made me stop," he said simply, looking at the little girl. Sophie gave him a shy smile, and for the first time, Adrien felt his heart grow lighter, as if he'd found a piece of himself he'd long forgotten. Elena stood up straight, her gaze still cautious but no longer so defensive. "I'll work hard," she said like a promise. "But if this is pity, I don't want it." "It's not pity," Adrien replied. "It's an opportunity for both of us." Sophie clutched her mother's hand, tilting her face up. "Mom, he's kind. I believe him." Elena looked at her daughter, then back at Adrien. Finally, she nodded a hesitant but resolute agreement. Adrien smiled a rare smile, and in that moment, he felt a glimmer of warmth slip into his cold world. You're watching Soul Stories, where every story whispers of love, healing, and hope. Let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our journey. Now stay with us. The story is just beginning. Morning sunlight streamed through the massive glass panels of Hawthorne Tower, casting a pale golden sheen over the wide marble-floored hallway. Elena Martinez pushed her cleaning cart, her black hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck, her hands moving swiftly to wipe down every surface. Each motion was precise, not a single movement wasted, as if she were turning cleaning into a quiet art form. She didn't say much, only nodding a polite greeting to a few office employees as they passed. Her gaze focused, her lips pressed into a thin line. But inside, Elena felt a rare sense of relief. This job, though exhausting, was an opportunity for her and Sophie to have a place to stay, at least for now. She wouldn't allow herself to dream too much, but every time she saw Sophie a little happier, her heart warmed in a way she hadn't felt in years. Sophie, her tiny backpack slung over one shoulder, often appeared in the hallways after school. She would skip along, her worn sneakers squeaking against the floor, chattering about what she'd learned that day. "Mom, today my teacher said I was the best at painting," Sophie exclaimed, proudly holding up a watercolor of a house by the sea. Elena smiled and brushed her daughter's hair back, though her eyes flickered with worry. She knew Sophie was starting to get used to this place, to the fragile sense of safety Hawthorne Tower provided. That comfort reassured her and terrified her. What if it all fell apart again? From his office on the top floor, Adrien gradually began to notice the presence of Elena and Sophie as a new rhythm in his life. He often ran into Sophie in the hallways, and the little girl always tried to draw him into her innocent stories. "Mr. Adrien, guess what? Today I saw a huge seagull outside the window," Sophie announced, her eyes shining as she gestured to show its size. Adrien, so used to tense conversations about contracts and profits, unexpectedly found himself smiling. "How big?" "As big as my desk?" he teased. Sophie giggled and shook her head. "No, but almost as big as your chair." Those moments left Adrien unsettled. He wasn't used to children, and even less to the warmth Sophie seemed to bring with her. She was bright and curious, with unexpected questions and sharp little observations. Once, when he explained how a building was constructed, Sophie frowned thoughtfully and asked, "But if you build too high, won't the clouds get sad because they're blocked?" The innocent question made him laugh, but it also stayed with him. Sophie saw the world through a clear lens, something he had lost long ago in the calculations of business. And then there was Elena, another puzzle entirely. Adrien watched her from a distance, whether she was silently working in the corridors or inspecting the cleaning team's progress. She never complained, even though he knew the job demanded both strength and endless patience. Once he caught sight of her scrubbing a stubborn stain on the glass door, sweat beading on her forehead, yet her expression remained steady, as though nothing could defeat her. That quiet determination made him respect her, and beyond that, it awakened a strange feeling in him, an attraction he didn't dare acknowledge. One afternoon, Adrien decided to go downstairs to where Elena was organizing supplies. "You're doing a great job, Elena," he said, leaning against the doorway, trying to keep his tone casual. Elena startled, almost dropping the mop. "Thank you," she replied shortly, her eyes flicking over him before returning to her work. But Adrien didn't leave. He stood there watching her neatly arrange every item. And then, almost without thinking, he asked, "Have you ever thought about doing something else besides this?" Elena stopped, looking up at him with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What do you mean? I need this job. I don't have time to daydream," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, her voice calm but edged. "I don't have a degree, no connections. This is the only way I can support Sophie." Adrien nodded, feeling a bit embarrassed by his question. "I didn't mean it like that. I just think you're very strong. I don't meet many people like you." He hesitated, unaccustomed to giving such sincere praise. Elena looked at him, her expression softening just a little, but she didn't say anything else. She turned back to her work, and Adrien walked away, his heart heavy. He didn't understand why he cared so much about her and Sophie. But every time Sophie ran up to him with a new story, or each time he saw Elena working with quiet resilience, he felt something in his heart being pulled out of the cold shell around it. That evening, when Sophie gave him a drawing of the three of them himself, Elena and Sophie standing by the ocean, Adrien felt his throat tighten. "This is you, Mom, and me," Sophie declared, her smile radiant. He took the picture and smiled at her, but inside a wave of emotion rose up. It wasn't just that he admired Sophie's bright mind or Elena's courage. He was starting to feel like they were becoming part of a world he'd once thought he didn't need. At dusk, pale golden light streamed through the window of Adrien Hawthorne's old office, casting a shimmering layer of dust across the room. Tucked away in a corner of Hawthorne Tower, this room held fragments of memories from the earliest days of his career. Crumpled sketches, contracts scrawled with notes, and a few forgotten picture frames gathering dust. Elena Martinez pushed her cleaning cart inside, the scent of old wood and ink floating in the air. She wiped the bookshelves with her usual care, though her mind was adrift, heavy with worries about rent and Sophie's future. Even though her job at Hawthorne Tower had been a lifeline, she still didn't dare to trust the fragile stability it offered. When she opened a drawer to dust inside, her hand brushed against a small wooden frame, its edges worn, wedged beneath a pile of papers. She lifted it out, wiped the dust away with her sleeve, and the photo came into view. Two young men standing on a beach, laughing brightly in the blazing sun. One of them was Adrien, younger, his dark hair tousled by the wind, his eyes shining with a rare joy. The other, Elena felt her heart skip a beat. Brown hair, a warm smile, kind eyes that face sliced into a memory she had tried hard to bury. Daniel, she wondered, her fingers tightening around the frame, her breath growing shallow. But how could it be? This was Adrien's office, and Daniel had been gone from her life for 9 years. This photo, likely from a time before she met him, made her doubt her own senses. She shook her head, trying to push away the sharp ache, and set the frame on the desk. Just someone who looked like him, she told herself, but her heart refused to settle. Just then, Sophie pushed the door open, her little sneakers squeaking across the floor, her small backpack bouncing on her shoulder. "Mom, today I got a high score in math," she chirped, but her gaze quickly landed on the photo on the desk. Sophie hurried over, reaching for it, and then, as if struck by lightning, she froze. "Mom, that's Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. "Daddy Daniel. I remember him from the picture you kept." Elena spun around, her head spinning. She dropped to her knees beside Sophie, clutching her daughter's shoulders, her eyes locked on the photo, and now looking closer, she could no longer deny it. It was Daniel, that smile, those eyes unmistakable. Memories rushed in like a wave, evenings by the ocean, unfinished promises, and the pain the day she learned he had died in that accident. "Sophie, are you sure?" she asked, her voice unsteady, though she already knew the answer. Her hand trembled as she touched the frame, as if it might bring Daniel back to her. Adrien stepped inside, a leather briefcase in hand, his expression harried as always. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Elena and Sophie, the little girl's tear-streaked face, the photo in her arms. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but edged with concern. When his eyes fell on the photo, his face drained of color, as if he'd just seen a ghost from the past. "Sophie, how do you have that picture?" he asked, his voice unsteady, stepping closer. Sophie looked up, tears sliding down her cheeks. "This is my daddy, Daddy Daniel. You knew my daddy, didn't you?" She hugged the frame to her chest, as if afraid it would vanish. Adrien sank into the chair behind him, his hands shaking as he reached for the photo. Daniel Hunter, his best friend, the one who had built big dreams alongside him, who had left the world in a car accident 9 years before. Memories flooded back, nights spent planning, laughter ringing across the beach, and that final time Daniel had mentioned a woman he loved, refusing to share the details. Adrien had never pressed, and now he felt a sharp regret for not knowing more about his friend's life. "Daniel, he was your father?" he asked, his voice hoarse, his gaze fixed on Sophie, searching for traces of Daniel in her face. Sophie nodded, clutching the photo even tighter. "He died when I was little. Mom said he loved me so much, but I never met him," she whispered, her voice full of longing. Elena, still kneeling beside Sophie, looked up at Adrien, her eyes flooded with questions. "You knew Daniel Hunter?" she asked, her voice trembling as she fought to keep her composure. "How did you know him?" Adrien drew a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as if to keep from breaking. "Daniel was my best friend," he said, his voice low as though confessing a painful secret. "We built this company together from nothing, but I never knew he had a child. He only ever said there was someone he loved, but he never shared more." He looked at Elena, an unspoken question in his eyes. You were that person?" Elena nodded slowly, her gaze distant, as if she were reliving all the years gone by. "I loved Daniel," she said, "but we broke up before I knew I was pregnant with Sophie. When he died, I never had the chance to tell him about her." She smoothed Sophie's hair, her voice breaking. "I never expected you to be his friend." Adrien felt his chest tighten. He looked at Sophie and saw Daniel's brown eyes, that innocent smile he had known so well. A heavy guilt rose in him for not being there, for not knowing, for all the unasked questions. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely, not even sure what he was apologizing for not knowing, for not asking, or for fate itself bringing them to this moment. Sophie wiped her tears and looked up at him. "You were Daddy's friend, so you're my friend too, right?" she asked softly, her voice full of hope. Adrien managed a faint smile, his heart aching, but somehow warmer than it had been in years. "Yes, Sophie," he said firmly. "I'm your friend." In the dusty room, the three of them stood together, drawn into an unexpected bond of fate. The old photograph, with Daniel's bright smile, seemed to bridge past and present, pulling them closer, even as the road ahead remained uncertain. After last night, when he learned Sophie was Daniel's daughter, Adrien's mind was in turmoil. He had called Martin Caldwell, his longtime attorney, in the middle of the night, told him about Sophie's existence, and demanded a thorough review of Daniel's will. "I need to know every detail." Martin entered, dressed in a crisp gray suit, his face grave. The man in his early 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes set a thick folder on the table. "Adrien, I reviewed Daniel's will as you asked," he said carefully. "There's one important detail we never explored in depth. Daniel left his entire 15% stake in Hawthorne Properties to his legal heir." Adrien frowned, a sense of unease tightening in his chest. "Legal heir?" he repeated quietly, as though trying to digest the words. He remembered the days after Daniel's death, when he named executor had taken over managing that stake. 15%, a large enough number to shake the company's control structure if it fell into the wrong hands. "You mean Sophie?" Martin nodded, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose and opening the folder, pointing to a marked paragraph. "Exactly. If Sophie Martinez is confirmed as Daniel's legal child, and with the information you provided last night, that seems almost certain she becomes the rightful heir to the 15% share. At present, you're managing those shares per the will, but if Sophie's existence comes to light, she'll become the center of attention, especially to people like Charles Merrick." Adrien felt as if something were squeezing his lungs. He got up and walked to the window, staring down at the sunlit coastal city below. The skyscrapers and projects he had poured his life into now seemed to blur behind the image of Sophie, the little girl with Daniel's brown eyes and the innocent smile that had awakened a part of him he'd thought long dead. 15% wasn't just a number on paper. It was a bomb that could destroy the company's stability and, worse, drag Sophie into the dirty power games of rival shareholders. "How dangerous is this?" Adrien asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Martin shrugged, his tone heavy with concern. If Merrick or any of the shareholders find out about Sophie, they will try to exploit it. They could petition the court to appoint another guardian for her, or worse, manipulate the shares through Daniel's family. With 15%, they'd have the leverage to challenge your control of the company. Adrien clenched his fists, feeling trapped between loyalty to Daniel and responsibility for the empire he had built. He remembered the days with Daniel, when they dreamed of a grand future together, when Daniel had once said, "If anything happens to me, you'll look after what I leave behind, right?" Back then, Adrien had just laughed, thinking it was a joke. Now those words had become a heavy promise, and Sophie was the embodiment of it. "I can't let Sophie fall into Merrick's hands," Adrien said, his voice firm, though inside he felt as if the ground were slipping out from under him. "He'll use her like a pawn." He turned back to Martin. "How many people know about this?" Martin shook his head. "Right now, only you and me, and a few former staff who handled the will. But if someone digs deep into Daniel's records, or if Sophie is publicly confirmed as his child, the news will spread quickly. Merrick has eyes and ears everywhere." A surge of anger rose in Adrien, not just at Merrick, but at himself, for not knowing about Sophie sooner, for not asking Daniel more while he still could. He looked at the photo on the shelf, Daniel's smile seeming to remind him of all they had shared. "I'll protect Sophie," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Not just for Daniel, but because she deserves to be safe. I owe Daniel that." Martin nodded, though his eyes were still clouded with worry. "Be careful, Adrien. This isn't just a legal matter. If Merrick finds out about Sophie before you're prepared, you could lose both the company and the girl." Adrien didn't reply. He turned back to the window, his gaze distant. Inside him, a new determination was taking shape, not just to protect the company, but to protect Sophie, the little girl who had become inseparable from his world. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe, no matter what it cost. On a weekend evening, Hawthorne Tower was quiet, only the lights from the office floors spilling down into the marble lobby. Adrien stood inside the empty apartment on the 15th floor, a spacious place with large windows overlooking the sea. The modern furnishings, white leather sofas, gleaming ebony tables were a complete contrast to the rundown apartment on Bayview Street where Elena and Sophie had once lived. He checked the room one last time, his hand brushing the edge of the table, his gaze thoughtful. The decision to invite Elena and Sophie to stay here hadn't come from his usual business instincts, but from something deeper, a responsibility he couldn't turn away from. He had called Elena earlier that afternoon, his voice steady over the phone, but carrying a determination that left no room for argument. "I want you and Sophie to move into an apartment here in Hawthorne Tower," he said, "not as tenants, but as my guests, for as long as you need." Elena was silent on the other end, and Adrien could picture her wary expression, the same one she always wore when she tried to protect her pride. "I don't accept charity," she replied firmly. But Adrien had interrupted her, his voice low but resolute. "This isn't charity, it's for Sophie, and for Daniel." Now, as Elena stepped into the apartment, Sophie trailing behind her with her little backpack, she paused on the threshold, her gaze sweeping over the luxurious space. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Hawthorne?" she asked, her voice still edged with caution. Sophie, on the other hand, had already skipped into the room, her eyes shining as she looked out the window. "Mom, look! The ocean is so beautiful!" she exclaimed, pressing her face against the glass, her breath fogging up a small patch. Adrien smiled a rare smile that softened the sternness of his features. "I'm sure," he said, meeting Elena's eyes. "You and Sophie deserve a safe place. Stay here. Don't worry about rent or anything else." He paused, feeling awkward under her steady gaze, as if she were trying to uncover some hidden motive behind his generosity. "Think of it as part of my responsibility to Daniel," he added, his voice roughening when he spoke of his late friend. Elena nodded slowly, her lips pressed together, but her eyes softened. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice sincere. "But I'll keep working. I don't want to owe you." Adrien nodded, respecting her resilience, though in his heart he knew he never saw it as a debt. In the days that followed, Elena and Sophie's lives blended into the rhythms of Hawthorne Tower. Elena continued to work hard, overseeing the cleaning staff with her same meticulous focus. But she began to notice small things about Adrien, the way he stopped to ask Sophie about her day, how he discreetly left a new box of crayons on the table for her, or the way he looked at Elena with a kindness she didn't dare return. Sophie, by contrast, bonded with Adrien almost instantly. She started calling him Uncle Adrien with a casual affection that startled them both. "Uncle Adrien, do you know how to play chess?" Sophie asked one afternoon, pulling him down to the floor with an old plastic chessboard. Adrien, who was more accustomed to tense boardroom negotiations, found himself laughing out loud as Sophie tried to trick him with an illegal move. "You can't capture pieces like that, kiddo," he pretended to scold, but his eyes were bright, filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Sophie giggled, flopping onto her back, clutching her stomach as she laughed. "You lost, Uncle Adrien. I'm better than you." In those moments, Adrien realized his heart was opening, little by little, to the child with Daniel's smile. From a cold billionaire who always kept his distance, Adrien was becoming part of Elena and Sophie's small world. He started adjusting his schedule, making time to share simple dinners with them in the new apartment, even if it was just pizza or spaghetti at Sophie's request. One evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep on the sofa clutching her old teddy bear, Elena looked at Adrien, her voice soft but sincere. "You don't have to do all of this, you know. Sophie and we're used to making do." Adrien looked back at her, his eyes quiet. "I know," he said, "but I want to. Not just for Daniel, but for both of you." He hesitated, unaccustomed to exposing his feelings. "Sophie calls me Uncle Adrien, and it means more to me than any contract I've ever signed." Elena smiled a rare, gentle smile that lit her tired face. "Sophie trusts you," she said quietly, "and I'm trying to trust you too." She turned away then, as if afraid her eyes would reveal too much. That night, back in his penthouse, Adrien stood by the window, looking out at the Black Sea. His apartment was vast, elegant, but for the first time, it felt empty. He thought about Sophie, about the way she said Uncle Adrien, with her bright, innocent joy, and about Elena, whose quiet strength left him both admiring and deeply moved. From a man who had only ever known power and profit, he was becoming something else, someone they could rely on, a role he had never imagined for himself. But now he knew he didn't want to let go. Still following the story? If this story found you outside of Soul Stories, we invite you home to where every touching tale begins with truth, hope, and heart. The atmosphere in Hawthorne Tower had grown oppressive, even though the light from the towering windows still shone as brilliantly as ever. Adrien Hawthorne stood in his office, gripping his phone tightly, his eyes locked on the screen, displaying a short email from Martin Caldwell. "Merrick is investigating. There's a source about Sophie. Meet immediately." His heart slammed in his chest, unease spreading like ink in water. Charles Merrick, his rival shareholder, with his serpent smile and boundless ambition, had always been a threat. But this time, he had crossed into the one thing Adrien was determined to protect: Sophie. Adrien had suspected Merrick for a long time, but this information confirmed the worst. After the conversation with Martin last week, he had ordered the legal team to tighten all security around Daniel's will. Even so, Merrick, with his network of informants in the business world, had apparently discovered Sophie's existence. An inside source had revealed that Merrick had quietly approached Daniel's paternal relatives, distant family members Daniel had barely mentioned while alive. They were a middle-aged couple in the suburbs, people who hadn't spoken to Daniel in years. But Merrick had skillfully lured them with promises of guardianship over Sophie and control of the 15% share she would inherit. "They're telling them it's about giving the girl a real family," Martin warned over the phone, his voice tight with worry. "But it's just an excuse to let Merrick manipulate the shares." Adrien felt hot blood rush to his head. He strode quickly down the hall, searching for Elena. He couldn't keep the will a secret any longer, not when Merrick had already begun to move. Sophie and Elena needed to know the truth, even if it shattered the fragile peace they were trying to build. He found Elena in the break room, arranging supplies, her hair tied back, her tired eyes still steady. Sophie sat nearby, doodling on a sheet of paper, chattering about something she'd learned at school. "Elena," Adrien called, his voice low but urgent. She looked up at once, recognizing the strain in his expression. "We need to talk. Privately." Elena frowned, wiping her hands on her apron, and gestured to Sophie. "Stay here and keep drawing, sweetheart. I'll talk to Mr. Adrien for a moment." Sophie nodded, oblivious to the heavy tension in the room. Adrien led Elena to a secluded corner of the hallway, where the afternoon light through the windows illuminated her features, worn but unbreakable. "What is this about?" Elena demanded, folding her arms, her eyes wary. "You don't usually drag me aside like this." Adrien took a deep breath, battling the urge to keep the secret one more day. But he knew time had run out. "I need to tell you about Sophie and Daniel," he began, his voice hoarse. "Daniel left a portion of Hawthorne Properties, 15% in his will, to his legal heir. Sophie is that heir." Elena blinked as if she couldn't comprehend what he'd said. "Shares? What are you talking about? Sophie is just a child." Her voice rose, threaded with confusion and fear. "Are you talking about money? Power? Some fight in your company?" Adrien nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. 15% is a significant amount, Elena. Enough to destabilize control of the company if it falls into the wrong hands. I kept this from you because I didn't want you and Sophie dragged into these ugly disputes. But now..." He paused, clenching his fists. "Charles Merrick, a rival shareholder, has learned about Sophie. He's approaching Daniel's distant relatives, promising them they can win guardianship to claim control over the shares." Elena stepped back as if he had struck her. "Guardianship? They want to take Sophie away from me?" Her voice trembled, her eyes flashing with panic. "Who are these people? They don't even know Sophie. They were never part of her life." She pressed a hand to her chest, her breathing ragged. "How long have you known about this? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Adrien felt a blade of guilt pierce him. "I've known since last week after we confirmed Sophie was Daniel's child," he admitted, his voice low but earnest. "I wanted to protect you both. I was afraid if you knew, you'd be terrified, or worse, that you'd leave to escape it all. But I was wrong. You deserve the truth." Elena turned away, her gaze drifting to Sophie through the break room window. The little girl was still drawing, innocent of the storm gathering around her. "Sophie is everything I have," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. "I lost Daniel. I can't lose her. You don't understand, Adrien. I fought my whole life to keep her safe." "I do understand," Adrien said, stepping closer, his voice soft but unshakable. "And I swear, Elena, I will not let anyone take Sophie from you. Merrick wants to use her like a pawn, but I'll do whatever it takes to stop him." He paused, searching her face. "I'm not doing this only because of Daniel. I'm doing it for Sophie, and for you." Elena looked at him, her expression torn between anger and anguish. "You say that so easily," she replied, her voice sharp but unsteady. "But if you didn't tell me the truth from the start, how am I supposed to trust that you'll protect us now?" She shook her head and turned away, but then stopped. "I need time to think about this. But if anyone tries to touch Sophie, I won't forgive it. Not even you." Adrien nodded, accepting her anger. He knew he had been wrong to keep her in the dark, but he also knew that from this moment on, he would have to fight twice as hard, not just to protect Sophie, but to earn back Elena's trust. As she returned to the break room and wrapped her arms around Sophie, as if to shield her from the entire world, Adrien stood alone in the hallway. He felt a fire ignite in his chest, fury at Merrick, determination for Sophie, and something more complicated when he thought of Elena. The secret was out, but the real battle had only just begun. The ocean wind swept across the high balcony of Hawthorne Tower, carrying the salty scent in the biting cold of evening. Adrien Hawthorne leaned against the railing, his gaze distant, fixed on the horizon where the sea and sky dissolved into darkness. The phone in his hand vibrated with a new message from Charles Merrick. "Meet me at the gala tomorrow night, Hawthorne. We need to talk about Daniel's heir, or the press will do it for me." The threat was short but sharp as a blade, making his chest tighten. Merrick had uncovered Sophie's secret, and he wasn't afraid to use it to try to bring down Adrien's entire empire. In Adrien's mind, everything was a tangled mess. Charles Merrick didn't just want Sophie's shares, he wanted control of Hawthorne properties. News of a secret heir would trigger a storm on the stock market, crash the company's share price, and open the door for Merrick to manipulate the board. But what terrified Adrien most wasn't the company, it was Sophie and Elena. If Merrick went public, Daniel's paternal relatives, emboldened by Merrick, would swoop in to fight for custody of Sophie, dragging her into a legal battle Elena could never hope to win. Adrien turned back into his office, where the plans for the multi-billion-dollar coastal resort lay spread out on the desk. This was the biggest project Hawthorne Properties had ever undertaken, the dream he and Daniel had shared since the earliest days. Abandoning it meant walking away from months of negotiations, millions in investment, and his own reputation. But Merrick had issued an ultimatum: give up the project in exchange for his silence about Sophie, or see everything his company and Elena and Sophie's lives thrown into chaos. It was a double-edged blade, and Adrien knew time was running out. He found Elena in the apartment on the 15th floor, where she was helping Sophie with her homework. The soft light from the desk lamp glowed across her face, softening the tense lines he'd come to know so well. Sophie, her hair tied loosely, was chewing her pencil, mumbling about a multiplication problem. When Adrien knocked, Elena looked up, her familiar wary expression flickering in her eyes. "Sophie, go read in the other room for a little while," she said gently, though her voice couldn't disguise her worry. Sophie nodded and carried her books into the other room, leaving the two adults alone in the stillness. "Something new?" Elena asked, standing, folding her arms as if to build an invisible wall. "About Sophie? Or Merrick?" Adrien drew a deep breath, feeling like he was stepping off a ledge. "Merrick knows about Sophie," he said, his voice low and heavy. "He's threatening to reveal that she's Daniel's heir. If that happens, the company's shares will collapse, and Daniel's relatives will have grounds to file for custody." He paused, searching her face for her reaction. "He made an offer: if I abandon the resort project, he'll stay quiet." Elena blinked, her face going pale. "Abandon the project? That's your dream, isn't it?" Her voice shook, a mix of anger and fear. "What are you going to do, Adrien? Sell everything to protect your company, or let her get pulled into all this by people who don't care about her?" Her words felt like a blade. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Elena, I don't care about the company as much as you think," he said hoarsely. "Yes, I built it from nothing, but if I have to choose between the company and Sophie, I choose Sophie and you." He stopped, his heart thudding, as if he'd just spoken a truth he'd been trying to bury. "I'm not doing this just because I owe it to Daniel. I'm doing it because I've fallen in love with you and Sophie. You're my family now." The confession spilled out so suddenly that they both stood frozen. Elena stepped back, her eyes wavering between disbelief and something she wasn't ready to name. You mean that?" she asked in a small voice, as if afraid the answer would shatter something fragile. "Or are you just saying this so I'll go along with your plan?" Adrien shook his head, stepping closer. He reached for her hand but stopped when he saw her tense. "I mean it, Elena. I've spent my life knowing nothing but work and money. But when I met Sophie, when I saw how you fought for her, I realized I wanted something more. I want to protect you both, not because of any will, but because I can't imagine this life without you." Elena turned away, pressing a hand to her chest as if trying to hold back a rising wave of emotion. "I don't know how to believe you, Adrien," she whispered. "I already lost Daniel. I've lost so much. If you do this and Sophie gets hurt..." Her voice broke, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I won't survive it." Adrien felt his heart ache. He wanted to pull her close, to promise everything would be all right, but he knew words alone weren't enough. "I won't let that happen," he said firmly. "I'll abandon the project if I have to, but I'll also find a way to stop Merrick. I won't let him touch Sophie, or you." Elena looked at him, her eyes softening, though fear still lingered there. "Then what will you do?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "What's your plan?" "I'm going to face Merrick in court," Adrien said, clenching his fists. "He thinks he can use Sophie to manipulate me, but he's wrong. I'll protect this family, Elena, no matter what it costs." Elena nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the door where Sophie sat reading. "I'll stay with Sophie," she said firmly, But if you really see us as family, don't ever keep anything from me again." Adrien nodded, feeling as if a vow had just been carved into his heart. As Elena turned back to Sophie, he stood there watching her, his heart heavy but resolute. The choice ahead wasn't easy, giving up the biggest dream of his life or risking losing everything. But thinking of Sophie and Elena, he knew he had no choice but to fight. You're watching Soul Stories, exclusive to our channel. If you're still with us, drop a comment. We read and cherish them all. Subscribe to support more heartfelt original stories. Thanks for being part of the Soul Stories family. The morning at Hawthorne Tower was somber, even though sunlight still streamed through the large windows and reflected on the marble floor. Adrien stood in his office, gripping a stack of legal documents that had just arrived from Martin Caldwell. The petition for custody of Sophie, filed by Daniel's distant relatives Margaret and Ronald Hunter, lay on the desk, each word sharp as a blade. Charles Merrick, exactly as Adrien had expected, was behind them, pouring money into a team of high-powered attorneys to turn Sophie into a pawn in his power game. Adrien felt hot anger rising in his chest, but he held it back, his gaze fixed on Sophie's name on the paperwork. She wasn't just Daniel's heir, she was the reason he woke up every morning with a purpose he hadn't known he needed. Elena sat across from him, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her eyes cold but unable to hide the fear. She had come the moment Adrien called, leaving Sophie with a staff member in the lounge so the girl wouldn't hear any of this. "Who are they, Adrien?" Elena asked, her voice trembling but steady. "These people have never been part of Sophie's life. How dare they try to take her?" Adrien pushed the documents toward her, his voice low and heavy. "Margaret and Ronald Hunter, Daniel's aunt and uncle. They live in the suburbs and they haven't spoken to Daniel since he was young. But now they've filed for custody, claiming Sophie needs a proper environment, a stable family, good income, a decent home." He paused, his expression darkening. "They're backed by Merrick. He hired the best lawyers to push this through fast. But Elena, it's all just a cover. They want Sophie's 15% stake." Elena shot to her feet, planting her palms on the desk, her eyes blazing. "Her shares? They want to use my child to make money?" Her voice cracked with pain and fury. "Sophie isn't some asset. They don't know she loves to paint, or that she likes stories about the ocean, or that she's afraid of the dark. They don't know anything about her." She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to keep from falling apart. "I've done everything to protect Sophie. I can't lose her, Adrien. I can't." Adrien rose, stepping closer, wanting to lay a hand on her shoulder but stopping when he saw her tense. "I know," he said quietly but firmly, "and I won't let them take her. I've hired the best legal team. We'll prove you're an excellent mother, that Sophie is safe and happy with you." He paused, searching her face. "And with me?" Elena looked at him, her expression caught between despair and a fragile spark of hope. "You say that like it's easy," she whispered. "But they have money, lawyers, Merrick. I'm just a single mother, cleaning offices. How will the court see me?" Adrien clenched his hand, feeling a tide of anger rising not only at Merrick and the Hunters, but at a system that could dismiss the love she had for her child. "They'll see the truth," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "I'll make sure of it. Merrick thinks he can control everything, but he's underestimated me. And he doesn't understand that Sophie isn't just about shares, she's family." Elena slowly nodded, wiping away a tear that slipped down her cheek. "I don't know if I can trust you completely, Adrien," she said softly but sincerely. "But I know you care about Sophie. If you say you'll fight for her, please help me. Don't let them take her away." Adrien felt something in his chest ease even as the weight remained. He nodded as if sealing an unspoken vow. "Thank you, Elena," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes." The preliminary hearing took place in a cold courtroom, the dark wood-paneled walls pressing in with an oppressive weight. Elena sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, her gaze locked on the judge. Sophie, thankfully, was waiting in a nearby room with a social worker, spared the strain of it all. Adrien sat beside Elena, his black suit immaculate, but his eyes hard as steel, the look of a man ready for war. Across the aisle sat Margaret and Ronald Hunter, a middle-aged couple with polite faces and cold eyes. Margaret, her hair in a tight bun, kept glancing toward their attorney, a tall, thin man with a smug smile who Merrick had paid handsomely to lead their case. The hunter's lawyer rose, his voice smooth as silk. "Your Honor, my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Hunter, only wish to provide Sophie Martinez with a stable, appropriate environment. They have a spacious home, secure finances, and can offer her everything she deserves: excellent schooling, medical care, and a real family." Meanwhile, Miss Elena Martinez is a single mother, employed as a manual laborer, living in housing supplied by Mr. Hawthorne. Is that truly the best environment for a child? Elena dug her nails into her palms, but stayed silent, her eyes burning with rage. Adrien rested a steady hand on her shoulder, a small gesture, but enough to remind her she wasn't alone. Their attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, stood and spoke, her tone calm but cutting. "Your Honor, Ms. Elena Martinez has raised Sophie with unconditional love and sacrifice. The child is healthy, well-educated, and thriving. Mr. Adrien Hawthorne, a close friend of Sophie's late father, has provided safe housing and financial support to ensure Sophie has every opportunity. The Hunters, meanwhile, have not contacted Sophie in 8 years. Their motivations, as we will demonstrate, are tied to the 15% stake in Hawthorne properties that Sophie inherited from her father." The courtroom stirred, and for a split second, Margaret Hunter's eyes flickered with panic before she schooled her face back into composure. Adrien leaned closer to Elena, whispering, "We have the upper hand. They have no grounds beyond Merrick's money." Elena nodded, but her eyes stayed full of fear. "If they win, Adrien," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I can't survive losing Sophie." Adrien took her hand in his for the first time since they'd met. "They won't win," he said firmly, "I promise." The hearing ended with a temporary decision. Sophie would remain with Elena, while the Hunters were granted supervised visitation. Adrien knew it was only a small victory. Merrick would not stop here. As they left the courtroom, he looked at Elena, seeing the strength in her eyes, and he knew this fight wasn't just for Sophie. It was for the trust growing between them. They stepped into the hallway, and Sophie came running from the waiting room, throwing her arms around Elena. Then she looked up at Adrien and, without hesitation, flung herself into his arms. "Uncle Adrien," she cried, her voice choked. "You were Daddy's friend, so I trust you. You won't let them take me away, right?" Adrien knelt and wrapped his arms around her, feeling his heart splinter and swell all at once. "That's right, kiddo," he said, his voice rough, eyes stinging. "I'll always be here for you." As he looked into Sophie's brown eyes, he saw Daniel's face, his friend, who had laughed with him on the beach, who had trusted him with their shared dreams. And in that moment, Adrien realized Daniel hadn't just left behind shares or responsibilities, he had left him the greatest gift of all, Sophie, and the chance to become a father Adrien had never believed he deserved. Elena watched them, her tired face breaking into a fragile smile, gratitude glimmering in her eyes. "Thank you, Adrien," she whispered, her voice shaking, "for fighting for her." Adrien stood, still holding Sophie's hand, and looked at Elena. "Not just for Sophie," he said quietly, sincerely, "for both of you." He knew the battle wasn't over, but with Sophie in his arms and Elena at his side, he felt strong enough to face whatever came next. In the days leading up to the final hearing, the air in the 15th floor apartment of Hawthorne Tower felt heavy, like the sky before a storm. Elena sat by the window, her gaze distant as she stared out at the sea, her mind captive to fear. Sophie was on the floor, playing with her colored markers, innocently drawing a picture of 3 people standing together by the shore. Every innocent stroke was a blade reminding Elena of what she stood to lose. She clenched her hands so tightly her nails dug into her palms, fighting back the swell of panic. "I don't want money," she whispered shakily, as if confessing to herself. "Sophie and I just want peace. As long as she's with me, I don't need anything else." Adrien stood across the room, feeling the desperation in her voice. He stepped forward and knelt beside her, his eyes steady and calm. "Elena, I promise you, Sophie isn't going anywhere," he said, his voice low and warm. "You and Sophie are my family. I'll do everything to keep you both safe." He took her hand, gently but firmly, as if trying to pass her the strength he was pouring every ounce of himself into maintaining. Elena looked at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. "You don't understand, Adrien," she said, her voice catching. "They have money, lawyers, Merrick. I'm just a single mother. If they take Sophie from me—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the pain in her eyes said the rest. Adrien gripped her hand tighter, his gaze unwavering. "They won't win," he said firmly. "I've instructed my legal team and every investigator I have to work around the clock. We have proof, clear evidence that Merrick is backing the hunters not for Sophie, but for the 15% stake she inherited. The court will see the truth." In the days that followed, Adrien never stopped working. He met with Martin and the legal team, combing through every transaction, every email, every phone call Merrick had used to manipulate the hunters. A former employee of Merrick's, pressured into unethical work, finally agreed to testify, handing over documents proving Merrick had promised the hunters millions if they won custody of Sophie. "They don't care about that child," Martin reported grimly. "They want her shares so Merrick can control the company." Adrien nodded, his eyes hard as steel. On the day of the final hearing, the courtroom felt more suffocating than ever. The dark wooden walls and the cold air made Elena feel like she was stepping into an arena. She sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tight they trembled, her breath uneven. Adrien sat beside her, immaculate in a black suit, his eyes never leaving hers, a silent anchor. Sophie, as always, was waiting safely in a side room with a social worker, blissfully unaware of the storm raging around her. The hunter's attorney rose, his voice smooth and practiced as he repeated his argument. "Your Honor, my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Hunter, are simply seeking to provide Sophie Martinez with a stable, appropriate environment. They have a secure home, financial resources, and a blood relationship to the child's late father," he said confidently. "Meanwhile, Miss Martinez relies entirely on Mr. Hawthorne, who has no blood relation. Is that truly the best environment for this child?" Elena bowed her head, her nails digging deep into her palms, but she felt Adrien's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a reminder she wasn't alone. Clara Nguyen, Adrien's attorney, rose with a calm but razor-sharp tone. "Your Honor," she began, "we have clear evidence that Mr. and Mrs. Hunter are not acting in the best interest of Sophie Martinez, but are being manipulated by Charles Merrick, a rival shareholder who promised them financial gain if they succeeded in taking custody." She paused as the room stirred. "We have documents, emails, and sworn testimony from a former employee who will confirm this scheme." Margaret Hunter lowered her gaze, her face flushing red, while Ronald avoided the judge's eyes. Clara presented each piece of evidence: the recordings of Merrick's calls to the hunters, detailed emails promising payments, and the testimony of the former employee. "Mr. and Mrs. Hunter have not seen Sophie in 8 years, Clara emphasized. "They know nothing about her, have no bond or sense of responsibility toward her. Meanwhile, Ms. Martinez has raised Sophie with unconditional love, and Mr. Hawthorne, a close friend of her late father, has made every effort to protect and support them both." The judge's serious gaze swept over the courtroom as she took careful notes. After an hour of tense arguments, she rapped her gavel, signaling for quiet. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing arguments from both parties," she said, her voice deep and resonant, "the court awards full custody of Sophie Martinez to Ms. Elena Martinez, with Mr. Adrien Hawthorne named co-guardian. Mr. and Mrs. Hunter are granted supervised visitation, but no decision-making rights regarding the child. This ruling is final." For a heartbeat, Elena felt her heart stop, and then it burst with relief. Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they were tears of joy. She turned to Adrien and threw her arms around him, clinging to him as if afraid it might all disappear. "Thank you, Adrien," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for keeping her with me." He wrapped his arms around her, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Not just for Sophie," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "For both of you. I won't let anyone separate us." He smoothed her hair, his eyes full of unshakable promise. As they left the courtroom, Elena held Adrien's hand, feeling as if a tremendous weight had finally been lifted. Sophie came running from the waiting room, hugging her mother tight, then turned to Adrien with a beaming smile. "Uncle Adrien, I get to stay with Mommy forever, right?" she asked, her eyes shining. "That's right, kiddo," Adrien said, kneeling to embrace her. "Forever." He looked up at Elena, saw her smile, and knew that even though the road ahead would not be easy, they had built something real, a family forged from trust and love. The sunset stretched across the beach, painting the sky in a vivid canvas of orange and purple. The waves lapped gently against the shore, blending with the salty breeze to create a tender symphony. Adrien Hawthorne stood on the sand, his light gray suit stirring in the wind, his hand clenched around a small box in his jacket pocket. In front of him, a beautifully set dinner table awaited. Flickering candles, sparkling glasses of wine, and a bouquet of white flowers at its center. This wasn't an ordinary evening. It was the moment he wanted to share with Elena and Sophie, the two people who had transformed him from a cold billionaire into a man longing for a family. He had invited them to this dinner, telling Elena it was to celebrate the victory. Elena walked down the path to the beach, her white dress fluttering in the breeze, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, highlighting her quiet strength. Sophie ran ahead, her bare feet leaving little footprints in the sand, calling out, "Uncle Adrien, is there ice cream? I want chocolate ice cream." Her laughter was like sunlight, melting away every last trace of tension in him. "There's ice cream, kiddo," Adrien replied, winking at her before turning to Elena. "Thank you for coming, Elena." He led her to the table, his palms slightly damp with nerves of feeling so unfamiliar for a man who had commanded boardrooms with icy confidence. They sat down, and Sophie chattered about the picture she'd painted at school. Elena watched Adrien quietly, as if searching for something in his eyes. After dinner, when Sophie wandered to the edge of the water to build a sandcastle in the twilight, Adrien drew in a deep breath and stood. "Elena," he began, his voice low, trembling just slightly, "you and Sophie changed my life. I used to think all I needed was the company, power, the numbers. But when I met you both, I realized what I really wanted was a family." He paused, his gaze locked on hers. "Daniel left me the greatest gift, not the shares, not the business, but Sophie, and the chance to become a father and a husband." Elena blinked, her breath catching. Adrien dropped to one knee in the sand, reaching into his pocket for the small box. He opened it to reveal a simple silver ring, glinting in the candlelight. "Elena Martinez," he said, his voice husky, "you taught me that family is the people we choose to love and protect. I choose you and Sophie. Will you marry me?" Tears shimmered in Elena's eyes, but she smiled a smile both shy and luminous. "Adrien, I never imagined I'd stand here hearing these words," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I lost Daniel. I thought I'd never open my heart again. But you gave Sophie and me a home, a family." She paused, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Yes, I will." Sophie, hearing her mother's voice, came running over, her big brown eyes wide with curiosity. "Mommy, what's happening? What's Uncle Adrien doing?" She looked at the ring, then back at Adrien, and suddenly beamed. "He's asking you to marry him, isn't he? Mommy, I have a daddy and an uncle, and now I have a real family." She threw her arms around them both, laughing as sand dusted her dress, making Adrien and Elena laugh through their tears. Adrien slipped the ring onto Elena's finger, never looking away from her eyes. "Thank you, Elena," he murmured, his voice low. "And thank you, Sophie. You are the greatest gift Daniel left me." He wrapped Sophie in his arms, feeling the warmth of her small body, and realized that Daniel hadn't only left behind a daughter, he had given Adrien the chance to become a father, a role he had never believed he deserved. Under the sunset, the three of them stood together on the sand, the waves singing a song of trust and love. Adrien looked at Elena and Sophie, and for the first time, his heart felt something he had never known: wholeness. From a man who had once lived only for power, he had found a family built on hard choices, redemption, and love that had grown out of responsibility.